And I said, this is not a safe place to build a nuclear power plant. And they said, but TEPCO told us it was safe. So I took a baggie out of my backpack, and I held up a baggie, and I said, these are the rocks that those reactors are sitting on. And I took a rock out, and I crumbled it like sugar. And they said, we're all going to write stories about this. And all of them wrote articles that were in the Japan newspapers the next day. Even the most conservative one, the Yomiuri News, which was started by a military war crimes character who was very pro-nuclear power, and he used the Yomiuri News to promote nuclear power in Japan and sell it to the public. Even their reporter wrote an article about it. So here we have a country that is just an accident waiting to happen. And I wrote a 2004 article for the Japan Times after the Hamaoka visit, and I hope all of you will read it. It's in English on the internet, and it's called Japan's Deadly Game of Nuclear Roulette. Now, the tragic thing is that every nuclear power plant can be converted to natural gas, because all that reactor does is boil water to turn the turbines to produce electricity. You can take the reactor out, put a gas burner in, produce 8 times more energy, much cheaper, eliminate the environmental hazard of the emissions, because all of the radiation from operations every day goes up the stack. And it ends up in all the fields and the food and in the water, drinking water, and in babies' teeth. I've collected 6,000 baby teeth from children living around nuclear power plants in the U.S. with a small group of scientists. Dr. Ernest Sternglass is one of them, and he helped to convince the Senate to sign the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963. I also collected baby teeth in Japan, in Tokyo, and the radiation levels were the same as for children living around nuclear power plants in the U.S. The 2 babies that had the highest strontium-90 levels in their baby teeth were born in Washington, D.C. So, nuclear power is not compatible with life, with welfare, with good health, but it sure is compatible with bankers, and that's why we have it. And the other reason we have it is because Queen Elizabeth, I call her Queenie, owns all of the mineral rights to 27 countries, the British Isles, and many territories, the Commonwealth. And she even owns the mineral rights to the international maritime limits, which are 200 miles offshore. So all the wind farms, the BP oil platforms offshore, they all belong to her personally. She owns over 35 trillion, I'm sorry, she owns land worth over $35 trillion. She's the richest person in the world. And she has huge, huge uranium deposits in Canada, in Australia, in other countries, and it's completely worthless dust unless you have an industry, even a fraudulent and corrupt industry, that gives you a way to sell it. That's nuclear power. This is Hamaoka from the air. It's on the ocean, and the 4 reactors you can see. These are the 4 reactors, and these are the turbine buildings where the steam is piped there to turn the turbines to produce electricity. After 90 minutes after cooling stops in a nuclear power plant, the reactors go into meltdown. Now, after the accident, the cooling systems did not work for almost 24 hours. They couldn't get the backup systems to work. The pump for the cooling systems that operate normally is down close to the ocean. It's right on the beach. So that got flooded and destroyed by the tsunami. The first backup system is diesel, and that's in the basement underneath the reactor. And after a 32 or 34-foot wave, tsunami went over that building. It flooded that system. Then there was the battery backup system. They couldn't get that to work. So almost 24 hours after the earthquake, they still did not have cooling in those reactors. So they were actually in advanced stages of meltdown. In September, TEPCO secretly put MOX fuel in unit number 3. MOX fuel is mixed uranium and oxide. It's extremely dangerous. It's very hazardous when it escapes into the environment, and it's very hot and hard to control. That was unit number 3, which was the second one that blew up. That's the plutonium and uranium oxides and spent fuel rod, detritus and dust and smoke that's going up into the air. And that has now contaminated the whole northern hemisphere. This is the control room. Now there are the emergency responders in not very effective protective gear. They really should have air tanks and complete covered enclosed suits on them, but they don't. It's so radioactive in that plant that everyone who has worked there is going to die of radiation poisoning. This is what I call Japan's kamikaze emergency responders. And they're being paid $5,000 a day to work there until they die. And the scam of it all is that General Electric, I believe, has been directing TEPCO on the emergency response. And like 9/11, like Hurricane Katrina, like the BP disaster in the Gulf, and now Fukushima, the regulatory agencies have stayed back. The politicians have stayed back. The TEPCO officials have stayed back. The international agencies have stayed back. So TEPCO has been running that the whole time. They do not have the technical ability to make the correct decisions to respond to this disaster. And the tip-off was when Hillary Clinton announced as Secretary of State 4 or 5 days after the disaster that she was shipping a plane load of boron to Fukushima, and that's what they should have used on the first day since it was already in meltdown. And boron is what you dump on nuclear materials that are going into a runaway fission process because it absorbs the neutrons and stops the fissioning. So she announced that she was sending a plane load of boron to Fukushima, and immediately, within a couple of hours, there was a denial in the press, in the mainstream U.S. media, that that boron was going, or that we were even sending anything. Now, what is that noise? Oh. So that was a tip-off right there that someone else was running that emergency response, and they were not running it to end the disaster, they were prolonging it. Oh, also, when you look at aerial photos and whoever robots or whatever took photos inside, in the aftermath, it's very clear that there's no way they could have gotten cooling systems or these reactors ever back to normal or under control. And so they absolutely should have covered everything with boron and shut down the fissioning and then cemented over the whole plant. Instead, they fooled around, they pumped salt water in. The salt water reacted with the exposed molten fuel because not only was one of the reactors ruptured from the top to the bottom, but the fuel rods were ruptured from heat expansion of the pellets as they got hotter and hotter. And then the seawater got into contact with the molten fuel, or the not so molten fuel, but the hot fuel. And it created reactor number 3, which is the MOX reactor, blew up. Now what's really interesting is that the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier was sitting 100 miles offshore when the MOX building blew up. It was Prime Minister Nakasone in the 1980s of Japan who went to Washington, D.C. and made a secret agreement with President Ronald Reagan to bring MOX fuel to Japan. Interesting. The MOX building blows up and the USS Ronald Reagan is sitting there. They set up helicopters, measured the radiation, and got the hell out of there because they were contaminating the aircraft carrier, the planes, the personnel, everything. And then reactor number 3 blew up, and reactor number 4 did not. It blew up, but not as badly. So they had a total disaster. By this time, the rods had melted through the bottom of the reactors. The reactors and the molten fuel were melting through the bottom of the plant, and they are now down in the soil headed for the groundwater. There's no way to stop it now unless you tunnel under that reactor fuel that's moving down and pack boron under there. Finally, not very long ago, maybe a week ago, the U.S. government urgently requested that Japan stop using salt water to cool the reactors because the salt builds up in the pipes, it builds up inside the reactor, and it absolutely makes the disaster worse because it impedes the flow of water that's cooling what they're trying to cool. It's completely insane. Now, what happened is they put the MOX fuel in Unit 3 in September. In October, the Japanese government discovered that 63 computers in Japan had been infected with the Stuxnet computer virus. The Stuxnet computer virus was written by the CIA and the Mossad to be inserted with a flash drive into a computer system inside power plants that use Siemens controllers because power plants are off-grid and offline, and that is to protect them from terrorist events. 1 month before this disaster, an Israeli security team had just finished installing a new security system, and they must have been the ones who put the Stuxnet virus into the Fukushima operating system. And that's why they couldn't get any of the backup systems working after the earthquake and tsunami. The Stuxnet virus was also used 6 months ago in Iran at the Bushehr centrifuge facility where they enrich uranium to make nuclear fuel for their nuclear power plants. It hides in the computer system and is programmed to go off at a certain time. And so in the Bushehr plant, all of the controllers and the workers were sitting in the control room, and all the dials said everything was operating normally, everything was just fine. But in the room where the centrifuges were, that virus made those centrifuges go faster and faster, accelerating until they just flew apart. So that virus destroyed half of the centrifuges in that Boucher facility. It was like 400 or 450. This is one of the buildings. This is probably this is probably the MOX one, because it had the biggest explosion. And you can see that it's kind of sort of unlikely that the cooling ponds on top of the reactor are even there. And it's also pretty realistic to imagine that they probably could never get that cooling system working. Anyway, it looks pretty destroyed to me. This is sort of hard to see, but it's a good example or a good summary of what happened on each day, and the power output and so forth and so on. So you can see that unit number 1 is the one more to the right. That blew up on March 12th. Unit number 2 blew up March 15th. Unit number 3, which is the MOX unit, blew up on March 14th. And unit number 4 blew up on March 15th. And they hardly even reported that the 4th one had blown up. And they kept putting out in the news in Japan and here that they were working hard to try and save the reactors. Well, it's so obvious there was nothing to save. So what they were really doing was delaying making critical decisions about introducing boron to stop the fissioning and then cementing over these plants. And what they were doing was accelerating the emission and the creation of more problems with more melting, and then it gave the reactors time and the molten fuel to leak down into the ground.